Good evening and welcome back to the Pauley Center at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Look back on the broadcast and you'll see we began this very show right from this room. In fact, the first performance was from this corner. You'll see me standing there singing at you a little bit of Strange Fruit. Tonight, to the program, you recognize some familiar faces, but some new music with the Rex Richardson Quartet.
That first tune, I guess I'll do this and put it back when I'm playing, was a great classic by Woody Shaw. This is a special tune for me because Woody Shaw is one of my biggest heroes, and it was the first Woody Shaw album that I bought that had a live version of this tune called Sweet Love of Mine. And I, so to speak, fell in love with it right off the bat, and have always enjoyed playing it. So this is something of a love set, I suppose you can say, we're going to play. Next, we're going to play another great classic called You Don't Know What Love Is. it's just hard not to have a smile on your face when you're playing with musicians like this. And this is a great setting. I'm so happy that VMFA and Richmond Jazz Society extended this invitation. This is just a joy to be here. And I'll remember to do this now. So, so we're going to finish our love set with What Is a Saying called Love.
Fellas, there are some quick hands and fast fingers in this group tonight. It is tonight, but today, right now. That's fantastic. I can't wait to hear what you've got cooked up next. But Rex, I think it's time for a break. Would you join me for a conversation?
Absolutely.
Right over here. Well, Rex, thank you so much for that first set of music. I am delighted. I almost said surprised, but that's not the right word. I'm delighted and so happy that it's working out so well for you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it was such a great pleasure. Just having a blast.
For us as well. Before we get into our conversation, would you take just a moment to tell the folks at home something about yourself in your own words?
Sure. Well, I've been in Richmond since 2002, and I moved here to take a position at VCU as a professor of trumpet. And I also teach jazz improvisation on the trumpet, so both classical and jazz trumpet. And that's probably the main thing I want to say. I've been here for a while, and so Richmond's the longest place I've ever lived in my life, so it definitely feels like home at this point.
It's a great place to call home.
It really is, yeah, absolutely.
It's where I was born and where I was happy to come back.
Oh, yeah, good for you.
When I became a grown-up, you know. So a long time ago, something happened that interested you in the sounds of music. Can you recall that for us? Why are you a musician today?
It's a great question. I'm sure everyone's story in this, I think, is kind of fascinating to listen to, you know. In my case, I was very, very young when my parents noticed I was interested in music. I guess about 3 years old, where I wanted them to put classical music on the car radio. And at some point, I took some drum lessons, and believe it or not, you wouldn't guess this from my voice, but I used to be a singer when I was a kid. I sang in the church and school choirs, and that was kind of my main musical outlet. Then my voice started doing this at about age 12, and quickly I was sort of done with my singing career. But I'd gotten a trumpet when I was 10 because I'm asthmatic, and the doctor had told my parents he should play one instrument, and my best buddy at the time played trumpet, so I figured I'd give it a shot. And by the time I was 13, I was getting really interested in it. And by the time I was 14, it was full bore. We had moved to Northern Virginia. I went to high school in Fairfax at Robinson High School up there. And I was just lucky that one of the best trumpet teachers anywhere in the country happened to teach the kids there. And so he set me straight and set me on a path so I could actually figure out how to do this.
That's quite an incredible journey. I was a singer too, but I kept it up.
You're still a singer, yeah.
I can't seem to get away from it, and I wouldn't want to.
No way.
Now,
yeah.
you're 12, 13, 14 years old. You've picked up a horn for the first time. At that age, were you listening to anyone? Who are your influences?
Yeah, it's funny. I think the first influences I had were, interestingly enough, the guys in the Boston Pops, and I would just see them on TV. This is actually before we moved to Northern Virginia while we lived in Hawaii, because my dad was in the Coast Guard. I'd see them on TV, and I'd be fascinated, and they were playing trumpets in different keys than my B-flat too, so I was confused and intrigued by that. And one of the guys named Tim Morrison, who's an incredible player who has played on a lot of John Williams soundtracks. He's been the trumpet soloist, and he was one of the guys I was seeing on TV, and years later, I got both to study with him and then perform with him, so that's kind of a nice, something I was very fortunate to experience. But after that, I started just raiding my parents' record cabinet, and they had old big band compilations. They had Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass back then. And from there, I started, as soon as I could, I started buying records. And some of my first records were Woody Shaw and classical trumpet players like Maurice Andre, and then Wynton was coming out with some of his first records around then. And Miles, of course, and it just sort of, it went from there, you know.
That's wonderful. I mean, you can hear the influences, I think, in the way you play.
Well, thank you.
And I want to get back to the influences, but before we do, tell me about the horns you're playing. What's significant about each one, and why is their tone different? What's the difference?
Sure. So I should say, I suppose, I've been a Yamaha performing artist since 1995, and so they're both Yamaha horns. And one of them, of course, is a straight-up B-flat trumpet that everyone starts playing on in band and usually will continue playing in some formats throughout their lives. And of course, it has the typical sort of relatively bright and Well, we hope brilliance is the word we aim for with the tone quality. And we hope not to be strident with it, of course. But the flugelhorn is the other horn. It's got, of course, a larger bell, but actually a smaller bore. And the internal size is smaller. And this combination makes for a very warm vocal sound compared to the trumpet. So typically you'll find people using the flugelhorn for more ballads or some contrast to the typical B-flat trumpet. And yeah, they're both great horns, and I love having the chance to play both of them to capture the character of different songs.
Is there any difference in the range each instrument is able to reach?
They're not technically, in the sense that, you know, the trumpet doesn't really have a top range. It's, some people have played off the piano, the top of the piano. I'm not one of those people. I can't do that. But the flugelhorn, in theory, can do the same thing. But typically, you're going to play more in the low register in the flugelhorn than you would on the trumpet. They both have the same lower register limit, except that their pedal tones are kind of notes below the normal range, typical range on the trumpet and the flugelhorn. And these don't tend to work very easily on the trumpet, and they do work very easily on the flugelhorn. So at one point, I hit a note, it was a pedal concert F, that is very hard to play nicely on the trumpet, but it just pops out on the flugelhorn. So that's a nice feature it has compared to the trumpet.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. I heard that. I thought, well, I never was able to do that. That's quite, I couldn't have done anything you did here today. We talked about some influential trumpeters. Who are the great flugelhorn players that you are inspired by? Well,
a lot of my favorite players played flugelhorn, although Woody Shaw didn't play all that much. He did on occasion. He played cornet a lot, which is kind of unusual. Freddie Hubbard, another one of my big heroes, played flugelhorn. Art Farmer played flugelhorn. Eventually he had a sort of a hybrid instrument that combined the attributes of the flugelhorn and the trumpet. He called the flumpet.
Oh boy, okay.
Not the most graceful name, but a beautiful sounding horn, and Art sounded beautiful on everything he played, of course. So those are some of my main influences. Interestingly, Wynton, who was one of my big heroes from the time I was a kid, he's never really played a lot of flugelhorn. He just got whatever sound he wanted on whatever horn he was holding in his hand, you know.
Some of us got it.
He's got it.
What are the big differences to you that you've noticed between playing jazz music and playing classical music?
Well, it's interesting because obviously in classical music you're usually not called upon to improvise. Although I've tried to find a way to inject that practice into my classical performances. Sometimes you have a cadenza in a concerto, or there might be a newer piece that is written with the design to implement some improvisation. But I think it's also, there's a different nuance on the instrument. You know, I think of it as that there's in some ways a different value system for the sounds. And when it comes to classical music, the basic foundation, of course, is from Western Europe. And of course, many, many other influences have come from around the world since then. But that's kind of the core idea of like, what's a beautiful sound? And when you hear a violinist or a great singer that exemplifies that, you know what it is. And in the case of jazz, I think there's much more of an interesting kind of hybrid, because so much of the concept comes from West Africa in terms of what makes for a beautiful sound. And then, of course, influence from early American music in the early 20th century, as well as Native American traditions here. And so you've got just a different nuance to the sound, and I think you want more texture to the sound and the articulation on the jazz side, while on the classical side you're looking for maybe a little more of a narrow range in terms of how you articulate and what kind of a sound you produce.
We are getting a sample of some of the great brass music in jazz here tonight, but can we take just a pause from jazz and talk about some of the great compositions for classical brass playing?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of standard pieces in the trumpet repertoire that everyone has to learn. Probably the most famous is by Franz Joseph Haydn, very famous composer, of course.
Absolutely.
He wrote one of the very first trumpet concertos. It wasn't really for trumpet, though. It was actually for something called the keyed bugle. It was one of the first brass instruments that didn't have a slide with which you can produce the entire chromatic scale in the lower and middle register. And so that's one of the biggest standards. And there are other pieces. Johann Nepomuk Hummel wrote another very famous concerto around the same time. And then we have more modern compositions by Henri Tomasi, famous French composer, and André Jolivet, another great French composer. So there are a few works that have had a big influence. There's a great composer I want to mention who, because he's a great friend of mine. He's also having incredible successes. His name is James Stevenson.
Okay.
He lives in the Chicago area, and he's been writing concertos for everyone. He's had pieces premiered by the Chicago Symphony and the Minneapolis Orchestra and President's Own Marine Band. But he wrote me a trumpet concerto, his second trumpet concerto about 10 years ago.
He wrote it for you? I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's
he
incredible.
wrote it for me.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's he likes puns, so he called it the Rex Stream concerto. But it's a really cool piece. I love playing, although it is difficult, but quite fun to play. So yeah, there's a really rich repertoire that we get to draw upon on the classical side.
We have been able to talk a little bit. There's so much more to learn in these conversations for those of you at home, but we've covered a little bit the way music is played that may be different between jazz and classical music. I'm talking about phrasing and coming in and coming out of what you're doing. Improvisation, you talked about, is less likely to happen in classical music, but the way your fingers move, the way you use your embouchure, is that any different?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there are some differences, especially in the embouchure, but I'm not really very much aware of them technically. It's mostly a different sound concept that I think is causing subtle changes, both in terms of how the tongue is contributing to the articulation.
That's it.
And the way the sound is being produced. So I look for the same core sound. I want a nice, rich, resonant sound in both styles. But I also like a little more kind of color at the edges on the jazz, and a little more, almost a bit of a crunch or texture on the front of the notes. And so, to be honest with you, I'm not really sure what is changing when I do that, but I know it's definitely influenced by hundreds of hours of listening to specific artists and trying to emulate the kind of articulation they were using.
I like that. I like how you zeroed in on physiological things, the use of your tongue, the shape of your mouth, maybe it is. My mom used to tell me, find the right mechanism to make that sound that you're looking for. And certainly I sing differently if I'm doing opera or if I'm singing a jazz standard. And like you said, I'm not always aware that I'm doing something different, but there must be.
Oh, for sure. And it's probably just your concept of the music that is driving these changes. Because a lot of it can be so complicated that I said, I'm going to do this with my lips and tongue to make the sound. I might do that with my lips and tongue and still not get the sound. But lots of times, if we focus on the sound and the concept, then our bodies, I think, are pretty good at creating the sounds that we want to emulate. And so I tend to rely on that. And then if it's not working, that's when I'll get more into the mechanics to try to figure out what needs to change.
When you got it, you got it. That's how they say that.
I wouldn't say that about me.
Well, my ears are saying it. I'll tell you that one. Now,
thank you.
Those of you at home don't know this. We had some scheduling situation, which meant that not many. There were originally 6 going to play on this program,
right?
And Cameron and Daniel were not among those that list.
Right.
I only call that out because the performance is so excellent tonight and so together. It's amazing to me that in such a short amount of time you have produced this excellence. Tell me about how something like this happens.
It's in many ways it's a tribute both to the Richmond jazz scene and to these particular musicians. I mean, there's such a rich scene here where you have these world-class musicians hanging out in town and playing. So I knew when I called Daniel and Cameron, who I've worked with both in many different contexts over the years, that would be as good as I could possibly hope for. And then I'd be keeping up with them. And Kofi, of course, is fantastic. Yes. And he and I have a new association. We only played together for the first time just a few months ago. But he's also just a world-class, dynamic, incredible musician as well as drummer. So those guys, they just worked it out on the fly. It's really amazing and inspiring to be playing with them,
I am absolutely inspired by that. That's incredible to me. This very quick music that you can't even really land on any note where it's going to be. Tell me about this style, this performance that you're giving. Where does it come from? When did it start?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of our influences are coming originally from the post-bop school. I mean, the folks who were, I would say, both hard-bop and post-bop. A lot of the stuff that people get into the late 50s and the 1960s between, my heroes, Woody Shaw and Freddie Hubbard and Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, John Coltrane, there was a certain aesthetic that their bands created in terms of how they dealt with time, how they dealt with form and harmony. And so a lot of the tunes were essentially treated to that, with also a little bit of a different influence. And one of the tunes, You Don't Know What Love Is, had maybe a little bit of an R&B kind of vibe to it that we threw in there. And yet the harmonic and structural approach, I think, was still derived from those same elements. And there are a lot of musicians continuing sort of to expand upon that I typically listen to. Like Chris Potter is one of my favorite musicians. I'm always checking out what he's doing, as well as a lot of others. And so it's very much in sort of the musical sense, a postmodern kind of approach. When anything that we know, if we can make it fit with the music in context, we want to try to make it happen. And it makes for a very rich performance opportunity, really.
It really does. I mean, there are moments in this broadcast of this performance where it seems like everyone's their own soloist, but somehow playing all separately in solo, unilaterally, it's coming together in concert.
It's something that you only see when there's super secure, really great security with the rhythm and the form. So that lots of times the bassist will be the anchor and stay the anchor for an entire performance. In this case, Cameron just started as anchor and then drift into other roles, because everyone is sort of keeping track of the time and the form, and that gives them a lot of freedom to essentially have more improvisation with everyone going on at the same time, which frankly is my favorite way to play. You know, when I'm hoping to be surprised by the rhythm section, and I was multiple times in this performance, always in a good way, and something that challenged me to try to respond to.
It takes a lot of faith in each other.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
We've talked several times on this program about the importance of a great educator. We've also talked about the great quality of musicians in Richmond, Virginia. You are among that list of great educators, teaching at VCU, a great school of music here for our community.
Thank you.
Where do you see, as an educator for the current musician students, where do you see it going in the future? Is there still hope that we're going to keep being as excellent as we are?
Oh, yes. Well, I think for sure. The past couple of years, or really last year and a half or so, have been a bit of a shock. More than a bit of a shock, of course, the music industry. And things are not quite back to normal yet, obviously. But there's progress. And I think there's a certain kind of resilience to musicians. We just have to do this. That's what it comes down to. We have to find a way to make it happen. And I tell this story lots of times when I have students who are frustrated. I said, look, there are so many times I would have quit if I could have. I just couldn't stop because I was frustrated with my own playing. But you keep going, and eventually it comes together. And I think now on an industry-wide scale, we're facing that, where the musicians who are really drawn to do this are going to find a way to do it. They're becoming more technologically informed. They're finding new ways to create venues for the performance. And I think many musicians have viewed this as much as a setback, even more as a set of opportunities to expand upon their craft. In my case, I've practiced more in the last year and a half than I have probably since I was in my 20s. So that was the silver lining for me, to be able to practice and do more composing, and even to write a book that just should be out next month, actually. So these are some new opportunities I probably wouldn't have had if I was keeping my normal touring schedule and teaching schedule.
Well, let's not lose the opportunity to talk about this book you've written.
Oh, okay.
Tell me about it.
It's very trumpet specific or brass specific. It's called 100 Days of Trumpet Practice.
Okay.
It was inspired by the hashtag that was going around early in the pandemic, which was 100 Days of Practice. And musicians were basically trying to challenge themselves to post something of their practice session for 100 days in a row. And I got on board with this and started making videos that became a little more involved, and I was really interested in the pedagogy opportunities with this. And then I was approached by a Swiss publisher, Editions BIM, and they said, hey, why don't you do a book based on this idea? And so we've got one now. I just submitted the manuscript a couple months ago, and it's almost finished. We're hoping this can be released next month, and I'm very excited about that opportunity.
Congratulations. When
thank
that
you.
happens, how can we get a copy?
Well, it's I can get you one. I mean, unless you're playing a lot of trumpet, you might not find it terribly interesting. You might not want to spend any money on it. I'll get one for you.
I haven't picked up my trumpet since I was in high school myself, but I'm always eager to learn more about this craft we call music. I can't tell you how many times I did quit, trying to think I'm going to do something else, but you can't get away from it. Here I am still.
You're a singer. You've been a drummer. I mean, you've got it all going on still. You know.
What would I be doing if I weren't doing this?
That's what I feel like. Exactly.
Well, Rex, we have enjoyed a first set of music. We've chatted good and lengthy. Sometimes I'll get tired of my own voice. Are you ready to give us set 2?
Am I ready? Oh yes, absolutely. Yes. We're ready to go.
All right, we're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Robert.
So now we're going to play a tune by another one of my heroes, Freddie Hubbard, who had written this tune for yet another one of my heroes and a dear friend of his, Booker Little. Booker was another incredible, really innovative trumpet player back in the early 60s, but he left us very young. And Freddie wrote this tune in tribute to him. It's called Lament for Booker. All right, well, once again, I want to thank this amazing band, Daniel Clarke on the piano, Cameron Ralston on the bass, Kofi Shepsu on the drums, and I'm Rex Richardson, and absolutely delighted to have received this invitation again by VMFA and the Richmond Jazz Society to share some music with you, and thank you for watching. We're going to close our set with Caravan.
Kofi, Cameron, Daniel, and Rex Richardson filling out his quartet. I think you've successfully awakened every sleeping ghost that may be in this building. And they're going to party. That is fantastic. Folks at home, I hope you remember events like this and all we've done before and all we'll do in the future as you are setting up the soundtrack for your holiday season to come. Dial us back up. Let us entertain you when you have your guests or when you're preparing your Thanksgiving meal. I know this is what I'll be listening to when I have to cook. I got a new house and I'm hosting, and you guys are going to get the job done for me. Thank you, fellas. Thank you, B.J. Brown with the Richmond Jazz Society and the entire organization, all they do to support us. Remember, Tommy Productions in the room still, have been since day one. That's right, Kofi. And Chris Buford made the trek across the lawn to be in here in this room with us here tonight. We thank him as we always do. And those of you at home, thank you for loving with us. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you for learning from us. Tonight, from the Pauley Center at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. This has been our virtual Dominion Energy Jazz Cafe in this room or any other. I'm Robert Fennard. Good night.